Chernihiv itself was bombed in early March. It was I was told by the locals, I haven't checked this yet myself, but the guy who was actually doing the bombing runs was himself born in Chernihiv, which raises the question of how you can believe different stories about the place where you're from. When I was in the rubble, there was one really terrible bombing run which destroyed or partially destroyed 4 major apartment buildings in one neighborhood. And when I was there talking to people, I was struck by a few things, like how, just like this place for young people, like there was a kid there who was collecting books, collecting books. He had a book collection, and he found an iPhone in the rubble. Like he had all these books and he had an iPhone, and as he walked out, he said to me, "I found an iPhone," like that this is his childhood. But also one thing that struck me is that like in these apartment buildings, people don't necessarily know each other or know who they are. But then after the bombing, people did know who one another were because they had to help each other with things. And then it turns out when a building is destroyed that it has a history. One of the reasons you know that is that the same kind of bombing will destroy different kinds of buildings in different ways. So Soviet era panelaki, or Soviet era like buildings that were put together from modules are very vulnerable to bombing, it turns out, whereas post 1990s buildings are generally less so. And you literally see that worked out before your eyes. Or another thing, in this complex of buildings that was destroyed, one of them, it turns out, like this is something you would never have to know, but it turns out that one of them was built for survivors of the nuclear disaster in Chernobyl. And so they all came down and they got this building as a way of moving away from where they were. But that history would never have come out without this other event. When I went to the suburbs of Chernihiv, the villages around, I talked to a woman who had 5 Russian soldiers in her house, in her basement. And I said, okay, they're Russian soldiers, but like, where were they actually from? Were they Russian? Or were they some? No, they were from Bashkiria and from Tatarstan. I think maybe one of them was Russian from Russia. He was from Siberia, and they had a geography, right? They had a notion that that Ukraine was Russia, but it's a funny kind of geography because they're from so far away. They're from thousands of miles away in some cases, and there she is, and they're all speaking Russian together. And she's a native Russian speaker. She was talking to me in Russian. And they're telling her what Russia is and that she's in Russia, right? There's something very strange about that, but that's their deep geography, and there's something about it which seems to really matter. I'm going to leave you with the last example, which I'm sure you've probably already thought of, which is Kiev itself. So the way we think about cities often has to do with particular things that happen in those cities or in those neighborhoods. Like Wannsee might not mean anything to you, but Wannsee is where a famous plan was made for the extermination of the remaining Jews of Europe. And it's a part of Berlin. And so you cannot, once you know that, you can't hear Wannsee and not think about that. Or Vichy, right? So Vichy in France is, there's nice soda water and everything, but it's a spa town, but it's also where the collaborationist government had its capital during the Second World War. And so Vichy means that, right? It's very hard to take that away from Vichy. I would suggest that there's going to be a little something around Kiev like that, but in a positive sense, because Zelensky stayed, right? If Zelensky had left, many things I think would be different in the world and in our minds and in this class probably, but he stayed, and I think that makes Kiev means something different than it would have otherwise been. In other words, I'm trying to suggest that this deep geography, although it's real, is also fungible. It's changeable. It can be altered. It can be altered by human action. I'm thinking in particular about a couple of nights into the war, where he made the selfie video where he said, President tut, right? I'm here. And then he goes on, my advisors are here. We're all here. We're all right here. And he was countering Russian propaganda, which has said he had fled. That's part of it. But also, he was saying, I'm here, I'm going to stay, I'm reassuring people, right? And this is my last example of the point that maybe places and people aren't so interchangeable, right? That it matters a great deal that when he said, I am here, the buildings behind him were Kiev and not Lviv and not Warsaw, right? That everyone in Kiev, when he said, I am here, could recognize where he was in Kiev. And that, that I'm here was also the counter to a different kind of deep geography. Because at the moment when he said that, there still were bombs falling in Kiev, which were meant for him, and there were still groups of assassins moving towards Kiev, or actually inside the city of Kiev, who were meant to kill him. And they were operating under a different deep geography, deep geography which goes something like this. And I'm not, I don't have to invent this because it's what Putin said in 2021, 2022, that Russia and Ukraine have always been one place, and the people who say that Ukraine is a different place, they are somehow exotic, they somehow come from the outside, they're Habsburgs, they're Poles, they're Europeans, they're Americans, and therefore anyone who says that there's a Ukraine, there's something flawed about that person, they don't belong there, they simply need to be removed, and we'll remove them lexically by calling them Nazis or whatever it takes, but we're also going to remove them physically, because if we remove them physically, then the rest of the Ukrainian people will go along with us and the war will be over. That is a kind of deep geography, right? And that deep geography animated the attempt to take Kiev and to kill this person. So I had a lot of time. I had time to think about that, because if you're visiting the president, it takes a long time to get there, obviously, because like they lead you here and they lead you there, and then you're never going to find your way out. They lead you here. It's all dark and confusing, and there are lots of checkpoints, and there are lots of barriers and things. And so it gets you to think, how important is it actually that this person is right here, as opposed to another person right here, or this person being somewhere else. So the deep geography is important. That was the point of this. That was the point of this. But also, the deep geography can be changed. The deep geography can be changed by action and by experience and by renaming. And I was thinking about that. As well. That I was there during this Kharkiv counteroffensive when the Ukrainians took back almost all of Kharkiv, and of course that means that Kharkiv Oblast now means something different than it did a few days ago. And for the men and women who were involved in that offensive, it's going to mean something different to them as well. And that the way, the fact that so many Ukrainians have had to move during this war, right, for bad reasons. 4 million deported to Russia, well over 10 million crossed a western border and come back. People inside the country, well over half the population has moved in one way or another. And that moving is associated with the changing of meanings. And sometimes it's associated with a changing of meanings in a positive sense. This is the very last thought. But I was really struck. I'm not trying to make a happy story of this, because of course it's not a happy story, but I was really struck by how, when people talked about all of this movement, whether it was the president himself, or whether it was some of the soldiers I talked to, or whether it was some of the people in villages that I talked to, when they talked about all this movement, they had interpretations of it, that like this in some way shows who we are, right? The fact that we went away and came back. The fact that we were able, or have already, a lot of people have already rebuilt their houses. The fact that we rebuilt, the fact that we got back to Kharkiv, right? The fact that Zelensky stayed, that these things say something about us, about who we are. So like where we can be pushed, we can be pulled, but then where we choose to be in the end says something about us. That we choose to fight this war, that we choose to help the people who are fighting this war, that we choose to make it through somehow says something about us, right? And so in that sense, like this thing that people are talking about as the formation of a nation, I think is not quite right. The nation was already there, but how people think about their nation, and particularly what they think it means to be free, and what it's worth sacrificing about, you can also connect that to space. In fact, I guess my point would be, you almost have to connect it to space. It's hard to imagine people having a story about themselves which involves risk and values, which doesn't also in some way involve space. And that's where I'm going to leave it. Thank you.